Hi, I'm Jackie Tantillo, and this is Should Have Listened to My Mother. I'm so excited. All of us here at Should Have Listened to My Mother really appreciate the effort that everyone went to vote for the 2023 People's Choice Podcast Awards. Should Have Listened to My Mother has been nominated in the leisure category, and we should know in a short while what the final results are. But thank you to all my loyal guests and listeners. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. You can find Should Have Listened to My Mother wherever you listen to podcasts, including my website, SHLTMMS4E34.simplecast.com. And please remember to tell a friend, subscribe, and like the show. Oh, many of us are familiar with the expression, behind every great man is a great woman. Well, in this particular case, behind every great man is a passionate mother. Passionate mothers, powerful sons, the lives of Jenny Jerome Churchill and Sarah Delano Roosevelt, the latest release from national best-selling author and historian Charlotte Gray. In just a minute, Charlotte will lend insight into two world-class leaders, Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who adored their mothers. These two women were dedicated to their sons. They went to great lengths to support and build networks in order to help mold their sons' careers. In describing the two mothers, Jenny and Sarah, Ms. Gray explains that their approaches to parenthood were as different as their personalities, yet each developed an unusually intense bond with their son. Charlotte Gray has written several acclaimed books of history and biography. A few of her works include The Promise of Canada, 150 Years, People and Ideas That Have Shaped Our Country. Her bestseller, The Massey Murder, A Maid, Her Master, and The Trial That Shocked a Country, won the Toronto Book Award, the Heritage Toronto Book Award, and many more awards. An adaptation of her bestseller, Gold Diggers, Striking It Rich in the Klondike, was broadcast as a television miniseries. She's an adjunct research professor in the Department of History at Carleton University in Ottawa. Charlotte Gray is a member of the Order of Canada and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. She is one of Canada's best-known writers and authors. Hello, Charlotte, and welcome to Should Have Listened to My Mother. I feel like I should be bowing to you.
Hi, Jackie. Well, it's great to be here and lovely to talk to you.
So you were born in England and then moved to Canada, is that correct?
That's right, yes. I moved in my 20s to Canada, thinking I was only going to be here for 3 years, and somehow I stayed.
Oh, well, I guess that's it. You seem to be doing pretty well for yourself. Canada's one of my favorite places for many, many reasons. So this book, Passionate Mothers, Powerful Sons, how and why, what bell went off that made you concentrate on this remarkable power or love that mothers have that want them to concentrate or mold or lift their children up and make them as great as they think they should be?
Well, I was particularly intrigued by these two women, Jackie, because there's this remarkable coincidence of they were both born within 60 miles of each other in and around New York, and in the same year, in 1854. And they they went in completely different directions during their lives. Jenny Jerome ended up in London and married the son of a duke. Sarah Delano Roosevelt never left the Hudson Valley, really, and stayed there her whole life. But they became the mothers of the two men who really shaped the world in the 20th century, Winston Churchill and FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. So I found the coincidence of them starting at the same point, going in completely different directions, and developing very different kinds of mothering styles and also relationships with their sons. Intriguing. Then I was amazed at actually following my interest, discovering how devoted the boys, as I still think of them, were to their mothers. I mean, when Jenny Churchill was dying, Winston Churchill ran through the streets of London in his pajamas, weeping with grief that he was losing his mother. And when Sarah died, it was the first time that anyone on FDR's staff had ever seen a tear in the president's eyes. So they were obviously powerful relationships. But it was also interesting to see how two women so different, with such different mothering styles, shaped their sons in particular ways, in the sort of primal relationships of their lives. Because, of course, I mean, as you've often noted in your podcast, the first relationship of any of us is our relationship with our mother.
But some children are fortunate, or whatever that power is that gives them the gift of having an influential and a loving and supportive mother, and some don't. Then you have the topic of helicopter parents, where kids rebel and revolt. They run as far away as they can. But it's that mother-son relationship. It's different from a mother-daughter relationship.
It's very different. And in fact, many biographers of Winston Churchill have looked at his relationship with his mother and accused Jenny of being absolutely heartless. I think it suited Winston Churchill's biographers, most of whom are men, to say this because they always want the great men of history to sort of spring fully formed. They don't want to spend a lot of time on intrusive mothers. So they chart Winston's quite unhappy childhood because he kept being sent away to boarding school, and his mother was a rather elusive figure in his early years. He was left to the care of a devoted nanny and never felt he got enough of his mother's time. But I think that those male biographers have actually been very tough on Jenny. She was dealing with a very difficult husband who became more and more erratic as Winston hit his teens. So she had to sort of compartmentalize her life and devote a lot of her time to looking after Lord Randolph Churchill, her first husband and Winston's father. Once Lord Randolph dies, and Winston's just sort of around the age of 20, then she turns this passionate spotlight of love on her elder son. And she does everything she can to help him, to promote his career, and really looked after him in a way that most sons today would resent, but he exploited it. I mean, he got her sort of doing everything for him, making introductions, choosing the furniture for his apartment, sending him books. You know, today, you would think, you know, this is ridiculous chauvinism on his part.
So let's go back a little bit to describe. So Jenny Jerome Churchill is Winston's mom. She was born in Brooklyn, and she's part Iroquois. Is that correct?
Well, that's the rumor. It's never been proven.
Okay. She was beautiful, though. She was stunning. She fell in love with the societal lifestyle, upper class, and then she married Lord Churchill. Lord
Randolph Churchill, the second son of the Duke of Marlborough, very grand, grew up in Marlborough Palace, which is one of the great ducal palaces in England.
Right, but he did start becoming a little erratic or reckless or something.
Yes, I mean, he always had the sort of sense of entitlement of the British aristocracy, but he was pretty wild. And frankly, I don't think many of us could have stood him. He was charming, he was witty, he was lazy, he was rowdy, he drank a lot. And he and Jenny had a glorious romance. You're absolutely right. She was so charismatic, extraordinarily beautiful. She always knew when she entered a room that she was the most beautiful woman in the room. They had a great love match, but you're absolutely right. His behavior became more and more erratic. He was a very difficult man to be married to. And, you know, on her emotional bandwidth, he wanted to take it all up. And he was never very nice to either of his two sons, Winston or Winston's younger brother, Jack.
And then conversely, Sarah Delano was demure and more reserved, both also from very wealthy families, high society, but you said, a completely different manner of raising our children. Both women were widowed at a relatively young age. I know that Jenny remarried a few times. I'm not certain about Sarah, but they had their next love of their life was their son, Winston and FDR.
That's absolutely right. The Sarah Delano came from an extremely wealthy family, one of 5 sisters. She was tall, elegant, very dignified, very impressive woman. And she married a man old enough to be her father, whereas Jenny, in fact, married her first husband was the same age as her. Her 2 subsequent marriages were to men young enough who were the same age as her son, Winston. Oh. But to go back to Sarah, once Sarah was widowed, she was still in her 40s, very beautiful, enormous wealth. She must have been regarded as a huge catch. She never remarried, though, because even while James Roosevelt, her husband, was still alive, Franklin was the focus of her life. I think it was a very difficult birth. She was told that she should never have another child. And so she cherished the one she had. Unlike Jenny, who farmed Winston out to a nanny, Sarah, in fact, kept sacking nannies because she didn't want anyone to get in between her and her beloved son. So Franklin grew up just in this sort of warm embrace of love and security. He was very rarely challenged, except by the fact that Sarah wanted to know exactly what was going on every minute of his life. And so he developed these habits and these hobbies like bird watching and stamp collecting, which kept her at arm's length, much to her irritation sometimes. But he really couldn't do any wrong in her eyes.
Did she go to school?
Both Sarah and Jenny had these educations which now looked incredibly privileged to our eyes, but were standard for upper-class American girls then. They might attend day schools, but the schools weren't nearly as important for girls as for boys back then. They certainly learnt to read and write and sort of acquire all the skills required. Jenny was particularly musical. She was a concert pianist standard. Sarah was bilingual by the time she was sort of in her late teens. In fact, Sarah spoke French, English, and German, and Jenny was bilingual English and French. So although they didn't go to school in a way that we'd understand, then they certainly never went. University wasn't even an option then. They were cultured and they were pretty cerebral, both of them.
If you had the means, you would travel overseas to attend school or this or that. And
they were both very well traveled. Sarah, in fact, had lived in Hong Kong for some years of her life because her father was a merchant trader. And then she had lived in Europe and gone to school in Europe. Jenny and her mother and 2 sisters moved to Paris when Jenny was around 11. And she studied in Paris, particularly, as I mentioned, music. So they were very cosmopolitan, very sophisticated in that way. And both of them, all their lives, they loved Paris. They loved the fashions. They loved the street life. They just felt it was the society where they felt most comfortable in some ways.
Yeah, don't we all love Paris?
Yes.
For those who have been fortunate enough to go and visit. But both women were often presented, I think you said, as lesser figures, because obviously women to have a political voice was not very common in that day and age.
They had no political options. Women couldn't vote. They certainly couldn't hold office. Yeah. They were the only way that they could have influence was sort of on the men around them who were politicians. For Jenny, her husband, Lord Randolph, actually was an MP and then a cabinet minister in Britain before he completely flamed out because he had such bad judgment. But Jenny was hooked on British politics as soon as she moved to London. Sarah, in contrast, actually thought politics was a rather dirty profession. She wanted her husband and her son to be gentlemen of the old-fashioned kind. But once Franklin got involved in politics, she decided, that there were politicians and then there were statesmen. And Franklin was a statesman, and she supported him to the hilt in every way she could. And it was interesting. I mean, it's one of the things I love about writing biography. You see how people change. You see how people change their views. Both these women actually grew up in pretty sort of in a society that was a bubble, which was actually rife with sexism and racism and anti-Semitism. And both of them, through their sons and through their own experiences, their views evolved, and they realized that, if their sons were going to be successful politicians and they were going to support them, they had to drop some of those attitudes. And of course, they met so many interesting people from all different kinds of backgrounds, and it gave them much greater exposure to a range of attitudes.
They also, because of their good fortune, they were able to financially help out with both of their sons in trying to achieve political success, correct? I mean, they invested quite a bit in it.
Sarah Roosevelt was very wealthy. She had both a share of the Delano wealth, and then she'd inherited from her husband, James. And she financed a lot of FDR's campaigns, particularly in the early years. And she also subsidized him and Eleanor when they were living in the White House, because the president's salary didn't cover anything like the expenses of a sitting president. Jenny was not wealthy. She behaved as though she was wealthy. She spent as though she was wealthy. She dressed as though she was wealthy. She was actually mountainously in debt her whole life. Oh, my
goodness.
It's a theme of the book. How does she deal with it? And so her contribution to her son's success was not in financial terms, but in terms of her network. I mean, she had the most amazing network of friends, and she could make introductions for young Winston, who was a brash, ambitious player. He wanted to make careers in both journalism and in politics, and she had phenomenal access to editors, to cabinet ministers. One of her lovers was the Prince of Wales in the 1880s and 90s. So, I mean, there wasn't anyone who she couldn't sort of contact and say, I wonder if you could help my son.
Sure. Well, think of what she'd be doing today on social media with all that notoriety.
She's
fabulous.
Such an influencer. She would be amazing. And we'd all love her. Because the other thing about Jenny, which I admire, is that she was this, as I said, this sort of sexy, charismatic, utterly beautiful woman. And she did have lovers, but she always made sure they weren't married to somebody else at the time. But women loved her too. If you read the memoirs of the period, they all say, no party was complete without the wonderful Jenny Churchill. So she wasn't one of those sharp-elbowed women who make their careers by being charming to men and ignoring women. She loved everybody.
Well, that's how you do it. I mean, whether it's authentic or not is another thing, but...
that's true. But it was authentic in her case.
It would be so wonderful to meet her, right?
Sarah was so different, but people found her a little intimidating. But as she got older, and she stood for sort of traditional values, traditional American values, and she became increasingly admired for that. And she was known, when her son was president, as the American matriarch. And for many people, she was a welcome contrast to Eleanor, who was seen as, this progressive advocate, who, frankly, many of the old-fashioned Democrats really weren't that keen on. They found her far too busy helping the underprivileged and not thinking about how to create wealth.
I had asked if you could read something from your book, Passionate Mothers, Powerful Sons.
I'd be delighted. Shall I start right away?
Yeah, that'd be great.
I decided to write about these two figures because I'm fascinated by the way that, whatever the restrictions on their lives, women have made choices and shaped the space available to their own purposes. Neither Jenny Jerome Churchill nor Sarah Delano Roosevelt would have considered herself a powerful actor in the patriarchal society in which she lived, where financial and political power belonged to men, and women were assessed almost entirely through the male gaze. At the same time, neither of these strong-willed women ever considered herself marginal to the society in which she flourished. Because they moved in such privileged circles, both had access to the leading lights of their time in politics and society, and both would use that access. Sarah and Jenny are such delicious opposites, one so relentlessly old-fashioned, the other so daringly non-traditional. With that and the fame of their sons, they seemed a natural for a double biography. We see them as trapped in ridiculous assumptions about women's roles, but that is not how they saw themselves. Their ambitious sons were lucky to have such formidable mothers.
You wrote somewhere that you want your writing to be like reading a novel, and it's just so vivid to me.
No, that's wonderful to hear. I try very hard to take readers into the picture so that, we start with anecdotes about both girls' childhood. Jenny sort of clinging onto her father's arm while he's steering a carriage and 4 horses down the middle of Fifth Avenue at top speed. And she just adores it. She's a risk taker. Whereas for Sarah, life was all about duty. And the anecdote for her childhood is she cut her head very badly once, and she ran into the study where her father was, and he looked at the cut on her head, which was gushing blood, and he realized the doctor was a long way away. And so he told her to pull herself together and he'd sew it up himself, which he did. And she barely uttered a cry because her duty was to control herself. And that was just the wonderful contrast between how these little girls were raised and then what they passed on to their sons. Because Winston Churchill was an incredibly emotional person who he always wore his emotions on his sleeve, whereas FDR was elusive, aloof, and people often just couldn't read him. They didn't know what he was thinking. He had a great capacity for self-control.
Are you saying that maybe they mirrored their mother's personalities that much?
They learned how to behave from their mothers.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the relationship with their mothers sort of reinforced those characteristics. Winston knew that if he was going to get his mother's attention, he had to be intensely demanding. And FDR knew that if he was going to get his mother's attention, well, actually, it wasn't a problem for him of getting his mother's attention. For FDR, the challenge was to keep his mother at arm's length, and that's what he learned from her.
Do you think that they ever, when the doors were closed and they were alone, they were doing the little ego dance of, I did it. My son has become exactly who I wanted him to be?
Sarah certainly did. She was intensely proud of Franklin and always trusted that he would do the best for the nation and was with him every step of the way. Sadly, Jenny never saw either her husband or her son become prime minister. Lord Randolph Churchill never did become prime minister, although he was tipped in the early years as a possible prime minister. But it was 20 years after Jenny died prematurely that Winston became prime minister. But she always had faith that he would be a great leader. She had total faith in him, just as Sarah had in Franklin. I mean, the belief in themselves that those two men had was rooted in their mother's strong belief in them.
Wow, you just said what every mother wishes and dreams for, I think.
I think that's right.
They can do something good for their son. There's one review that you got from Rosalie Abella, the former Canadian Supreme Court Justice and Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. She wrote, "It's a story about the passionate love of two remarkable mothers and their two remarkable sons, but it's also transcendently about all mothers and their sons." It's a beautiful book. It's a beautiful book.
Well, thank you. It was a lot of fun to write. And I think writing it, and I think for many readers who have sons, you really think, wow, mothers are so powerful. What would my sons write about me?
Yes, indeed. I think that all the time. Like, what are my sons going to think of me? Did I do it? You know, I know I've made mistakes. I'm human, but I hope that I'm giving them what they need to be happy. That's my big hope. I'd have no interest in telling them what to do. I just guess your actions speak louder than words more often than not.
But I think it's what one wants to give sons, and certainly Jenny and Sarah succeeded in this, was a belief in themselves. And these two passionate mothers really gave both their sons a strong sense of security and their own destiny and a belief in themselves, which at some points in their lives looked completely unjustified. I mean, Winston Churchill had a really down period, particularly in the 1930s. Similarly, FDR, in his early 20s, I mean, he was just a bit of a sort of man about town, lazy, good time guy, and didn't really get active until much later. So there were times when it just seemed that these guys were not going anywhere. But in the end, they came through. And in the end, both gave enormous credit to their mothers.
Passionate Mothers, Powerful Sons, The Lives of Jenny Jerome Churchill and Sarah Delano Roosevelt by Charlotte Gray. Bravo, Charlotte. Another one for the record books. Congratulations on your current release.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to talk to you, Jackie.
And we'll be back next week with another episode of Should Have Listened to My Mother. Thanks, Charlotte.
Thank you.